At 7:10 in the evening, the captain of the biggest ship on the Great Lakes keyed his radio one last time. 4 words: "We are holding our own." About 10 minutes later, the ship behind him looked down at the same radar screen, and the blip was gone. No distress call, no wreckage floating on the surface. 29 men on a 700-foot freighter vanished into Lake Superior in the time it takes to boil a kettle. This is the wreck of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, the largest ship on the Great Lakes, lost with all hands in a single November storm. We're going to trace the chain of decisions that sent her out that day, a storm that grew far worse than the forecast promised, and the final disputed hour before she went down. And stay till the end. Because half a century on, investigators still can't fully agree on how a ship this big simply disappeared. When the Edmund Fitzgerald was launched in 1958, she was the largest ship ever built for the Great Lakes, 729 feet of steel, a floating warehouse for iron ore. Sailors called her the Fitz, the Big Fitz, the pride of the American flag. For 17 years, she set cargo records, hauling taconite, pressed iron ore pellets from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills near Detroit. On the afternoon of the 9th of November, 1975, she left Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with over 26,000 tons of taconite, bound for a steel mill on Zug Island, near Detroit. 29 men were aboard, under Captain Ernest McSorley, 63 years old, more than 40 years sailing the lakes, and by most accounts, one of the most experienced captains on the water, reportedly close to retirement. She wasn't sailing alone. A second freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, fell in with her that evening and took a course close behind. Company on a big lake, nothing more. Late autumn on the Great Lakes always brings storms. Sailors call it the Witch of November, and every captain who's worked the lakes has sailed through one. The forecast that day was strong, but ordinary for the season. A gale, the kind both crews had ridden out many times. They were wrong about that. Overnight, the storm didn't just strengthen. It deepened far faster than predicted, as a second system moving up from the southwest fed into it and swung its worst winds straight across the two ships' path. By morning, a gale warning had been upgraded to a full storm warning. Both captains angled north toward the Canadian shore, planning to use the coastline as a shield. It was the standard move. It also put them in open water for the worst of what was coming. By afternoon, the wind wasn't gusting anymore. It was simply blowing, hour after hour, with gusts reaching hurricane force. And somewhere in the next few hours, the Fitzgerald began taking damage nobody on the ship behind her could see. Through the afternoon of November 10th, winds on Lake Superior climbed past 50 miles an hour steady, with hurricane-force gusts, and the seas built to 16 feet, then higher. Some reports put rogue waves near 35 feet, closer to an ocean storm than anything the lakes usually make. Just after 3:20 in the afternoon, McSorley radioed the Anderson with the first real sign of trouble. The Fitzgerald was taking on water. A section of railing was gone. 2 vents had been lost or damaged, and the ship had developed a list, a lean to one side. He also mentioned, almost in passing, that both his radars had failed. That mattered more than it sounds. Ore carriers on the lakes are long and low, built to be efficient, not to ride out an ocean gale. And this one rode low in the water, with only about 11 feet from waterline to deck. In seas this size, waves didn't just rock her. They broke clean over the deck, one after another. Any water getting below, through those damaged vents, or through hatch covers not fully sealed, would collect deep in the hull, where a lightly built freighter is least able to fight it. And with both radars dead, McSorley was now navigating blind, asking the Anderson to stay close and help guide him toward shelter. For the next few hours, the Anderson tracked the Fitzgerald on radar and stayed in radio contact. Here's one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Earlier that day, the Fitzgerald had passed close to a shallow ridge near Caribou Island, a shoal, and the Anderson's captain, watching her track, had thought she was closer to that shallow water than he'd ever want his own ship to be. Some investigators believe she may have brushed bottom there, tearing her hull from below without anyone aboard fully realizing it. Others say the damage came entirely from the storm. Nobody still alive can say which. At around 7:10 that evening, the Anderson called the Fitzgerald one more time to warn of another ship ahead. McSorley answered, and he sounded steady, no panic in his voice. He said they were taking a beating, but we are holding our own. It was the last anyone ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. About 10 minutes later, the mate on the Anderson checked his radar for the Fitzgerald's position, and the target that had been there all afternoon simply wasn't. At first, he assumed it was the storm interfering with the screen. He called again. No answer. He called other ships. Nothing. The Fitzgerald hadn't sent a mayday. One moment she was there, holding her own, and the next, she wasn't. The Anderson turned back into the storm to search, an act of real courage in those seas, and was soon joined by aircraft and other freighters. They found a few lifeboats and rafts, torn from their racks and empty, and scattered debris. They found no survivors and no one to rescue. In water that violent, a search could do almost nothing that night. 4 days later, a U.S. Navy aircraft detected the wreck on the lakebed using a magnetic sensor. Later, underwater surveys confirmed the worst. The Edmund Fitzgerald lay in over 500 feet of water, broken into two large pieces, about 150 feet apart. All 29 men had been lost, and no bodies were ever recovered. The Coast Guard's investigation concluded that hatch covers, not fully secured against the storm, most likely let water flood the cargo hold until the ship lost buoyancy and dove under. A separate review by the Lake Carriers Association rejected that and favored the shoal, that she'd struck shallow rock near Caribou Island and was already flooding before that final radio call. Structural failure, a wall of rogue waves breaking her back at once, or some combination, all remain on the table. 50 years on, marine investigators still don't agree. The lake that took her kept her secret. So what sank the Edmund Fitzgerald? Not one clear failure, the way most disasters finally resolve. A storm that outgrew its own forecast. A hull built for the lakes, tested against something closer to the ocean. A shoal that may or may not have been struck. Hatches that may or may not have held. Every theory explains part of it. None, on its own, closes the case. In 1995, the ship's bronze bell was raised from the wreck. Today, it hangs in a museum on the lake, and once a year, it's rung 29 times. Once for each man who went to work on a freighter that had crossed this lake safely for 17 years. In a storm, every one of them had reason to believe they could ride out, the way sailors always had before. Because on Lake Superior, in November, the distance between holding our own and gone without a trace can be as little as 10 minutes. And half a century later, we still can't say for certain why.